This is Watercolor Lesson 8, Seeing in Layers. How many layers will it take to tell a story? Theoretically, there's no limit to the number of layers of watercolor paint you can put on top of another and still observe a cumulative effect. Since each thin layer is transparent, the preceding layers will be at least partly visible, even if the paper has long since been completely obscured. There comes a point, however, beyond which the paint begins to lose its natural luminosity, when light can no longer pass through all the paint and reflect back from the white paper to the viewer's eye. The surface looks dull and lifeless. This alone would be a good enough reason not to pile on too many layers, but there's an even more compelling case for efficiency. In a way, the individual artist's understanding of a subject is the subject. What we see when we look at a painting is the way the painter has interpreted the scene. Much of the pleasure of experience as viewers, whether or not we are conscious of it, is seeing into the artist's mind. When we are shown only the essential aspects of the subject with nothing extra, we see the world fully translated into a few washes and strokes. There's a sense of collaboration between the artist and the viewer, as if we're being counted on to fill in the blanks. Simplicity of treatment in this Norwegian landscape is essential to the overall feeling of stillness. Looking at one major shape at a time, it becomes clear that there are no more than 3 layers in any area. The roof, for example, started out as very pale rectangle, light. The shadow above the bottom edge, the shadow above the bottom edge was a second layer, middle, and the edge itself was the third, dark. Count the layers that make up the small house in the background: roof, siding, windows. How does the artist know when such simple treatment would work? The skills involved in recognizing what is essential and what is optional are awareness skills. In this painting, it displays a deft hand. It's not the brushwork that's most impressive. He knew which were the truly telling aspects of his subject, and he gave us credit for being able to keep up with them. As viewers, we feel respected. There's no question that this is a satisfying painting, both in form and in content. Framing the backlit figures with a cool dark neutral highlights their radiance and focuses our attention on the dark-haired girl's fascination with her wonderful new shoes. A closer look, feature by feature, reveals that the painting could hardly have been simpler. This detail of my new shoes shows the efficiency with which John Yardley presents his subject, which is part of the appeal of the painting. Everything we need to know is here, with nothing extra. The artist stopped as soon as the story was told. We're presented with the essential information and invited to imagine the rest. With a fundamental economy of means in mind, I begin my translation of a subject by trying to understand it as a series of layers. I imagine a succession of transparent films that will add up to the appropriate degree of complexity for the subject. To get in the habit of seeing this way, it's useful to impose a limit on the number of layers you're trying to identify. Roughly speaking, I envision a first layer of the lights, a second layer of the middle values, and a third of the darks. Although it's sometimes subtler, I find that most subjects can be brought to life with just these 3. Looking at the detail of my new shoes, you can see how the sandals were painted with 3 simple layers of white paper: blue shadow, which is the light, pink stripes, the middle, and the brown stripes are the dark. So let's go back and look at that. Just the 3 layers. What we see when we look at a painting is the way the painter has interpreted the scene. Much of the pleasure of our experience as viewers, whether or not we're conscious of it, is seeing into the artist's mind. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to choose a subject. As we move along through this lesson, follow along and paint your subject 1 layer at a time along with me as we discuss and view the layering process. Resolving an image in layers. It is an unusual picture that can begin with a first layer wash that covers the whole page. Usually there's some reason to reserve whites or to refrain from putting the initial color under something that will come later. It is usually necessary, therefore, to consider the image as a collection of shapes and to envision the progression of layers for each one. Keeping the overall number of shapes to a minimum will help prevent confusion for both the artist and the viewer. Therefore, when you're assessing your subject, it's important to ask, how will the image resolve into layers? However many shapes, however, I don't know how to read. However many shapes you can gracefully juggle in your work, I recommend staying focused on the big picture, okay? For me, it's not work to bring one shape out to full realization while the rest of the shapes are still white paper, okay? That doesn't work. To help keep the whole picture tied together, block in the entire image with a first layer early in the process. I confess this is where I most often fail to follow my own advice, since I can't resist seeing how the part I'm painting right now will look with the next layer on. One problem with jumping ahead, though, is that I'm making choices about color, value, and the amount of detail based on proximity to white paper, which is not what will be there once I finish the first layer. Plus, if I complete each segment of a painting before moving on to the next area, the finished picture will look like a collection of separate little paintings on the same page. I try to work the whole page one layer at a time, not putting a second layer anywhere until I put the first layer everywhere. This is not an absolute rule. It's not even always possible, but the idea is to keep the shapes all working together. For instance, in the photograph here, the blue of the sky could not go under the warm colors of the walls, or even the palest pink of the door trim would compromise the purity of the blue. Since neither one would work as a preliminary wash for the entire page, I had no choice with this painting but to work shape by shape. So I would do the blue wash for the sky and then a separate wash for the rest of the painting for that first layer. There are 3 critical questions you should ask yourself before you paint each layer. I will pose these questions in turn as we watch a segment of a painting come to full realization. So the first question is there a way to paint the entire shape with a wash that can underlie everything that will come later? Blocking in each of the major shapes with its lightest tone leaves the door open to adding middle value forms later and then applying darks as needed. It's usually easy enough to tell which of the colors in a major shape will be the best for an overall first layer. Start by looking for the lightest tone. For instance, in this image, you could paint the whole shape the lightest pink that shows on the left facing surfaces of the door trim. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to be asking you that. Could you? If you decided that the light pink could safely underlie everything else on that wall, the doorway, the blue letters, the peach wall, the shadows, you're ready to prepare the supply of paint. Be sure to mix up a little more of the first layer color than you think you need so you won't run out in the middle of applying the wash. Before the first layer goes on, however, there's a second question to consider. Is there anything I need to paint around? If there are areas within a big shape that must remain lighter than the overall first wash, they need to be reserved, okay? Similarly, if there are areas that would be polluted by the color of the first wash, they must also be reserved, even if they're not lighter. You might be concerned, for example, that the pale green blocks of stone on the left would not turn out green if the pale pink were under them. If you're unsure about the effect of your choices and how they'll affect the future layers, try the color progression on your practice paper. In this case, the pink is so light, I'm sure it can safely underlie even the pale green. When you know what needs to be reserved, you're ready to apply the first layer. So how carefully the initial layer needs to be applied depends on several variables. First, your style. Is it casual or painstaking? Second, your subject. Is it an old stained stucco wall or a brand new house? Third, subsequent layers. How much of the first layer will be visible after all the layers have been painted? Fourth, the areas that need to be reserved. How complex are the parts that cannot receive the overall layer? Thinking and seeing in layers is in a sense simply following the path of least resistance. Putting darker, more specific strokes on top of broad light washes is the easiest way to build a painting. And with watercolor, the easy way is the right way. So now you're going to evaluate your subject. This street scene is basically an arrangement of 4 big rectangles: the sky, the peach-colored restaurant, and the first and second floors of the persimmon-colored house. The main color of each building is different enough from those of the other shapes that it would not be wise to start the painting with a single overall wash. In this demonstration, we'll focus on the largest portion of the scene that can utilize a common underlayer. What would your choice be for the first layer? The lightest area that is the left-facing edge of the door frame works. It is so pale, almost white, that it could surely underlie all the colors yet to come. Once the first layer is painted, ask yourself, is there anything I should do while this layer is still wet? In many situations, you may want to vary the color of the wash or tuck in a pattern of soft edge marks while the first wash is still wet. How long you expect these steps to take will determine how wet you need to make the wash. Texture and detail are often more suitably implied rather than specified. If I'm unsure how much information the picture will ultimately require, I know I can keep my options open by sticking to soft edges until I see the need for a more specific description. Consider suggesting a texture while the initial layer is still wet. Now you're going to locate the major shapes and apply the lightest lights. Since there's no white at all in the scene, the lightest pink on the left-facing sides of the door frame works as a first wash on the whole facade of the restaurant. Almost all of this layer will eventually be covered. Even so, I chose to put it everywhere, since it's much easier to paint the next layer on top rather than next to the pale pink. Excuse me. When the first layer is dry, you can address the same 3 questions to the second layer. The difference with the later layers is that the painting gets more complex, more individual shapes may appear. For instance, in the next image, the area that was one big shape is now 3 separated by color differences: pink door, orange wall, and green column. So add the second layer shape by shape. Because the door, wall, and column are such different colors, they cannot share the same second layer wash. Once the second layer is applied, all that is left of the first layer are the thin strip of light on the left face of the door frame and the highlights on the lamp. The variation in the orange wall color is added while the second layer is still wet. You can think of the layers as sheets of paint with holes that reveal some of each of the previous layers. I try to avoid having to color in one shape right beside another. If I'm not very careful, there'll be some places where the 2 shapes will overlap, making a third color, and other places where they don't quite meet, leaving a tiny white spot. It's much easier to simply paint one color right on top of the other. The cast shadows on the peach wall, for example, it would be foolish to leave them white while I paint the wall and try to color them in later. It is true that their color is not the same as the wall color, but the 2 are closely and meaningfully related. Not only is it easier to paint the shadow on top of the wall color, but it makes it more believable. Now you're going to add the third layer on top of the second. The shadows on the door, wall, and column are applied directly on top of the previous layers. Since shadows are usually a darker, more neutral version of the surface on which they fall, it works best to paint the shadow color over the sunlit color. The transparency of the paint allows the previous layer to show through, keeping the 2 colors related. This creates the illusion of light and shade. And then now you're going to add the finishing touches. The illusion of light was realized as soon as the shadows were applied in the previous step, but the darkest darks and the calligraphic details of the final layer provide substance and personality to the scene. So here we have the original photo versus how it was painted using the layers. So for your assignment, you're just going to follow those directions that I just laid out. You can pause if you need to pause, and you are going to create your own painting using your own subject.